Hi again. So this session we're going to talk about the role of the private sector in adaptation to climate change. But first, let's think about how most economies are operated. The reality is that most economies really are a mixture of decisions by the private sector, and by the private sector I mean individual households, and we make decisions about how much we're going to work, how much we're going to save, how we're going to spend our money. Individual businesses or firms, as we refer to them in economics, making decisions about what they're going to produce and what sort of production methods they're going to use. And we also have a role for the government or the public sector. So governments create their income by essentially taxing individual households and businesses, and then they use that to spend on things like defence, health, education, law and order. Now, of course, the division of the resources, the income and decisions between the private and the public sectors varies across different countries. So we might have at the lower end countries like Singapore, where their government sector is only responsible for about 20% of the economy, and the private sector for the remaining 80%. If we go to many of the typical OECD countries, such as America, Canada, New Zealand, then we've got the government sector accounting for about 1/3 of the economy and the private sector for 2/3. If we go to some of the Nordic countries, then the government sector is more than 50%. And if we go to some of the socialist countries, the former Soviet Union, North Korea, then we find that government makes nearly all the decisions. But even so, there are lots of private sector decisions. So what we're interested today is about the decisions made by that group of private households and businesses in how they would adapt to climate change. So in most countries, private sector households and businesses make decisions where the relative benefits and costs of their choice options with respect to climate change accrue to them. So they have the incentives and the rewards to get the story right. So if we think about personal comfort, an individual household has a decision of am I going to insulate my building, or am I going to put in an air conditioning unit, or I'm going to pull the blinds down, how am I going to set that air conditioning unit, and so on. So it's largely their individual choices, and even in the former Soviet Union, Big Brother, the Kremlin, didn't tell the individual household how to do it. In terms of food production and consumption, well, pretty much most households have choices of, yes, I know if I go down to the supermarket, that fillet steak is fairly expensive, sausages are fairly cheap. I could save my money by not buying the fillet steak and having sausages. I could have decisions about will I buy those really sumptuous but out of season cherries, or buy the old conventional apple that's pretty cheap. So those are sorts of decisions that households make in almost any economy. On the production side, the farmers decide, well, will I be an apple producer or an orange producer or a strawberry producer? What sort of production system will I use? Will I use lots of fertilisers, or will I go organic? Will I have lots of labour pulling out the weeds, or will I use pesticides? Or we can think about the construction and maintenance of buildings. You know, am I going to put up a little old building that the first decent storm comes, gets blown away, but it's relatively cheap? Or am I going to put in a double brick reinforced building that'll take a force 5 cyclone, for example? Now, of course, that more expensive building is better for withstanding adverse climate events, but of course it costs us money. And I might then have to spend less money on a smart air conditioning system to keep myself cool. So those are some of the sorts of private sector decisions that have to be made to adapt. Now, one of the things we like as economists about private sector roles in adapting to climate change is that that's a bottoms up. Individuals, either business or households, make the decisions. And this has, rather than the government, and this has a number of advantages. Generally, individuals know more about their individual circumstances. And of course, they vary. You know, I might like to not spend that much money on keeping myself comfortable temperature-wise, but I want to spend a lot of money on fancy food. My neighbour across the road might be quite the opposite. She might be somebody who just loves to be in a nice 20 to 22 degrees centigrade zone, day in, day out. And food, well, that's something that helps you sort of walk around, but that's not a big deal. People have different preferences and so on. So that's to repeat, individual circumstances vary. Now, the private sector knows about those incentives and it reaps the rewards from changing decisions about what to buy and sell. So am I going to buy that fillet steak or the sausages, or am I going to have an expensive air conditioning system or not? About how to produce it. So the farmer's making decisions, am I going to use pesticides or am I going to hire lots of people to pull out the weeds? And again, when it comes to adapting to climate change, individuals in most cases know more about their own decision preferences, their own decision options, than does Big Brother sitting in a remote government. So that's why there are great advantages in having the private sector make most of these decisions. But government can support those decisions. In particular, it can provide information about the form and magnitudes of climate change. So how much are temperatures going to go up? What's going to happen to rainfall? What are the prospects of cyclones or floods? All these sorts of events. And to help individual decisions, these are going to have to be at a very fine level of detail. It's not really that much good for the Chinese individual households to know that China as a country is going to be 2 degrees warmer in 2030. What you really want to know is what's going to happen in Shanghai or Hong Kong or a farm in one of the provinces. Government also can help us provide information about different decision choice options. How much cooler will my house be if I have it properly insulated? What are the costs of getting insulation done? Now, that sort of information can be available to lots and lots of people, and often it's more desirable for government to provide this information. Again, we want a regulatory structure that allows flexibility for households and firms to change decisions. Now, if we have a very tough government regulatory story that says thou shalt eat sausages at least 3 times a week and buy 6 apples, that doesn't give the consumer much choice. Or if the government says thou shalt build a house with these particular insulation conditions, that again doesn't give much choice. Often those rules are binding. This becomes even more important when we look at the business sector. If farmers want to change their production systems, say they want to move from organic to inorganic farming, or they want to change their machinery mix, or they want to buy the farmers out next door to adapt to climate change, if there are government regulations that make this more expensive and more difficult, then those extra hassles increase the costs of adaptation to climate change, and some individuals, businesses won't make decisions, and we wear much higher costs than otherwise. And there are going to be some cases where individuals need to make decisions in conjunction with others. Take the example of a rising sea level. One way of holding back that rising sea level and flooding your house or your gardens is to build a sea level wall. In general, that wall is going to provide benefits not only to you, but to all your neighbours. And so one of the challenges, how can we coordinate the decisions of all the people who might benefit from that seawall? Government has a key role in helping us put together our individual decisions. So yes, a major load of adaptation of climate change rightfully falls on the private sector, but in almost any sort of government structure, from a Singapore, not very big, to a Norway, very big role, we can see key roles for government to help the private sector make its adaptation decisions.